The ant is still alive when its jaws close for the final time. Something inside its body has steered it away from the nest, up a stem, and onto one exact spot on one exact leaf. Then the mandibles clamp down so hard the muscles start tearing themselves apart, and only once the grip holds does the ant finally die. Days later, a fungal stalk breaks through the corpse and turns the body into a launch pad for spores. It sounds like a horror movie, but the real story is stranger because there's no monster eating a brain. The fungus doesn't need thoughts, eyes, or a plan. Evolution simply built a biological chain reaction that can redirect a living animal from the inside. Scientists call the victim a zombie ant. The name hides the most disturbing detail. The ant isn't reanimated after it dies. It's recruited while it's still alive. For a short stretch, one organism's body starts working for another organism's future. That idea reaches far beyond insects. Every animal is really just a network, chemical signals, hormones, and muscle, held together by constant internal messaging. What feels like a single unified self is really just that network agreeing with itself. Change the messages, and you change the behavior. Most of the time, those signals are working for the animal that sent them. Parasitic manipulation is what happens when a second organism learns to intercept them. It isn't possession. It's biology hijacking biology. Popular culture flattens all of this into one word: cordyceps. The actual ant killers belong to the genus Ophiocordyceps, not one species, but an entire complex of them. Mycologists led by João Araújo and David Hughes have split what looked like a single fungus into well over a dozen separate species, each one fine-tuned to a particular ant. Move a fungus onto the wrong host, and the manipulation often just doesn't work. This isn't a universal trick. It's a set of tools built over a long, private evolutionary war with one specific victim. From a distance, the life cycle looks simple. A spore lands on a foraging ant. The fungus grows inside it, the ant wanders off, climbs, bites down, and dies, and fungal tissue rises from the corpse to release the next generation of spores. But every one of those steps only works if the last one happened in exactly the right place. A corpse in the wrong spot is worthless, destroyed if it's still inside the nest, too wet and exposed on the forest floor, too dry to survive in the high canopy. So the parasite is really solving one narrow engineering problem. How do you turn a moving ant into a launch platform parked in precisely the right microclimate? Natural selection can't plan ahead, but it doesn't need to. Fungi that happened to nudge hosts toward slightly better spots simply left more spores behind, generation after generation, until the behavior looks designed. The manipulation itself looks old. The best evidence traces these fungi back to ancestors that infected beetle larvae, long before some lineage jumped onto adult ants. That jump solved one problem and created another. Adult ants could now carry the fungus wherever they walked, but an ant colony is one of the toughest places on Earth to run an infection. A nest is crowded, warm, and packed with potential hosts, which sounds like paradise for a pathogen. Until you remember the colony functions as one collective immune system. Workers groom each other constantly, spot anything suspicious, and drag contaminated bodies straight out of the nest. A fungus that tries to reproduce inside that fortress is likely to be wiped out before it ever releases a spore. So the fungus doesn't fight the fortress. It picks off one worker and gets that worker to walk out the front door. The infection usually starts outside the nest, where the colony's older workers do the riskiest job, foraging. A microscopic spore sticks to the ant's shell, uses that contact to germinate, and forces its way through the cuticle with enzymes and raw pressure. Once inside, it reaches the fluid-filled cavity of the ant's body and grows as loose, yeast-like cells drifting through the hemolymph, nothing like the dramatic stalk that will eventually erupt from the head. For now, the fungus stays hidden, multiplying quietly inside a host that keeps walking, working, and living a normal ant life. An infected worker doesn't turn into a puppet overnight. The early changes are subtle enough that nestmates often don't notice anything wrong. Underneath, fungal cells are spreading through the tissue and rewriting the body's chemistry, while the ant's immune system fights back against an invader built for exactly this fight. From here, survival is a race. The fungus just has to stay ahead long enough to reach the next stage. Eventually, the ant's normal behavior starts to fall apart. Foraging loses its point, movement turns erratic, and the ant simply wanders instead of taking the efficient routes healthy workers use. That confusion isn't random. Every step it wanders is a step further from the nest, and a step outside the reach of the colony's collective immune system. Out here, alone, there's no army of nestmates waiting to tear the infected body apart. Isolation, a death sentence for any social insect, has just become the fungus's biggest advantage. Leaving the nest, though, is only step one. For the fungus to reproduce, the corpse has to land inside a very narrow window. The right humidity, the right temperature, the right height, the right leaf cover. Researchers have found that ants that die on the forest floor, or up in the dry canopy, often fail to produce any spores at all, which is presumably why the ant starts to climb. Biologists call this upward march summit disease. It shows up in several unrelated insect parasites. But height by itself isn't the goal. In tropical forests, manipulated ants lock their jaws around leaves at a strikingly consistent height and humidity, rather than dying at random. Line up enough corpses, and the forest itself becomes a map of exactly what the fungus needs to survive. And the fungus isn't only steering where the ant goes, it's steering when. Field studies have found the final bite tends to happen at particular times of day. Genetic work from biologist Carissa de Becker's lab found that the fungus's own genes for secreted enzymes and toxins switch on and off in a daily rhythm of their own, as if the infection is hijacking the ant's internal clock rather than just overpowering it at random. An ant normally relies on that clock to organize foraging, rest, and navigation, so corrupting it would be a remarkably efficient way to choreograph wandering, climbing, biting, and dying into one sequence. Nobody has mapped every signal in that sequence yet. What the evidence points to is a chemical campaign, not one master molecule. A wave of fungal genes for secreted proteins, enzymes, and toxin-like compounds switch on together during the manipulated phase, and different Ophiocordyceps species appear to lean on different combinations of them. Some may target sensory communication, others neuronal stress responses or immune activity, still others secrete compounds that act on the host from outside its own cells entirely. Evolution seems to have found several different chemical routes to the same final scene, and none of them adds up to a single instruction manual for mind control. Exactly how a fungal molecule turns into a specific ant behavior is still one of the field's real open questions, which makes what researchers found next even stranger. When scientists finally looked inside a manipulated ant, they expected fungal tissue invading the brain the way roots invade soil. They found almost the opposite. A 2017 imaging study led by biologist Meridel Fredrickson using 3D reconstructions of infected ants found the brain largely uncolonized at the exact moment of manipulation, surrounded by fungal cells, but not consumed by them. The brain's chemistry could still be altered from the outside without a single fungal cell ever taking up residence inside it. That finding wrecks the image of a puppeteer sitting in a control room pulling strings. The fungus doesn't need to occupy the brain at all as long as it can flood the body with the right chemicals. The same imaging showed the fungus's most dramatic takeover was happening somewhere else entirely, the muscles. Fungal cells packed the ant's body in a dense, interconnected network, clustering around the muscle fibers and linking up with each other, less a single commander, more a living web spread through the host. That's a smart target because literally every visible behavior an ant performs, walking, climbing, biting, comes down to muscle in the end. Walking needs precisely timed contractions across 6 legs. Climbing needs grip, balance, and constant micro-adjustment. Even turning the head and clamping the jaws comes down to motor commands converting into raw mechanical force. Interfere right at that final stage, and the body can betray its own nervous system. But the fungus has to thread a needle, destroy the muscles too fast, and it loses its vehicle before the job is done. So the damage has to be aggressive and restrained at the same time, just enough to bend behavior, not enough to make the ant collapse before it reaches the leaf. Then comes the bite. At the chosen spot, the ant clamps its mandibles onto a leaf vein or a twig, what researchers call, without much exaggeration, the death grip. This isn't a gentle hold that slowly goes slack. Under the microscope, the jaw muscles are locked in extreme, almost violent contraction. The fiber damage looks like one final, uncontrolled effort, with small fungal structures visible packed in around the muscle. Exactly what they're doing there is still being worked out. From that moment, the ant's own jaws become a clamp welded shut, and even after death removes all active control, the torn muscles and locked mandibles keep the body pinned in place. The fungus adds its own anchoring as it grows. All of that solves one very specific problem. A dead ant can't correct its position, can't resist the wind, can't climb back if it's fallen. Without that grip, the corpse could tumble straight out of the one microclimate the fungus needs to survive. For the ant, the story is over. For the fungus, the visible part is just getting started. Hyphae spread through the corpse, converting whatever tissue is left into fungal growth. The body becomes food and scaffolding at once. Roughly 7 to 10 days later, in the species studied closely, coordinated growth pushes a stalk, a stroma, out through the seam between the ant's head and body. A reproductive structure unfurls along one side of it, which is where the species name unilateralis comes from. Inside, new spores ripen and are eventually fired out under pressure, raining down toward the forest floor and the foraging trails below. What's left of the ant has essentially become a transmission tower, high enough to reach ants still walking past, but not so high that the spore-producing structure is exposed to unnecessary risk. Every spore that falls is another long-shot bet. Most land somewhere no ant will ever cross, or on the wrong species entirely, and fail to trigger the specialized relationship manipulation requires. Once in a great while, one lands right, and the whole cycle starts over. Do this enough times in one place, and infected corpses start piling up near the same colonies, forming the eerie clusters researchers have nicknamed graveyards. A graveyard doesn't mean the colony is dying. Long-term field studies have watched the same nests keep producing newly infected workers year after year while the colony itself kept functioning normally. This isn't an epidemic that burns through a population. It's more like a chronic tax. A handful of foragers disappear every month, and the colony replaces them with workers who eventually rotate into the same dangerous outdoor jobs. That constant turnover hands the fungus a steady supply of fresh, exposed hosts. Colonies already send their older workers out to do the riskiest labor, because losing an old forager costs less than losing a young one, and that same risk management strategy hands the parasite a reliable target. None of this is a war either side is trying to win outright. Nest defenses stay strong, the fungus operates beyond their reach, individual ants die, and the colony carries on regardless. It isn't peace, but it's stable enough to hold for years. Here's the part that's most unsettling. Nothing in this system understands any of it. No fungus knows what the ideal humidity is, or pictures a leaf, or calculates a height. Every part of this sequence exists purely because, generation after generation, the fungal lineages that nudged their host slightly closer to the right spot left slightly more spores behind. Behavior that looks intelligently designed can emerge from nothing but selection grinding through countless failures. Biologists have a term for this, an extended phenotype. The bite belongs to the ant's body, but the genetic information shaping that bite partly belongs to the fungus, which means the parasite's influence reaches out past its own cells entirely. A jaw movement becomes a step in fungal reproduction, a climb becomes part of a spore delivery system. The line separating ant from fungus gets genuinely hard to draw. This is exactly why the real biology is creepier than the fiction. Movies imagine one invader seizing a brain and issuing orders. What Ophiocordyceps actually runs on is distributed, growth spread through the body, chemical signals, rewired rhythms, and targeted muscle damage, with no single control center anywhere in the mix. Even the word control can mislead here. Researchers can measure reliable, repeatable changes in behavior without knowing whether the fungus commands every single one of them directly. Some of what looks like manipulation might just be sickness or tissue damage that natural selection learned to exploit whenever it happened to push the ant somewhere useful. That distinction matters, because evolution was never required to build perfect puppetry. It only needed infected ants to die in useful spots more often than random chance would predict, and that bar is a lot easier to clear than conscious control ever would be. There's a hard limit on how scared you actually need to be, though. This level of manipulation depends on an extremely specialized relationship built between one fungal lineage and one insect species over an immense stretch of evolutionary time. There's no evidence a zombie ant fungus can infect a human and run the same sequence. A human's nervous system, immune system, chemistry, and body temperature are simply the wrong environment entirely. Even a different species of ant can be the wrong world for a given fungal lineage. The danger is real, but it's narrow, aimed at the one host it spent millions of years learning to exploit. That narrowness doesn't make the story less important, though. Parasites like this expose the hidden weak points built into every living system. They're proof that behavior can be steered through channels that have nothing to do with conscious thought. That muscles, metabolism, sensory signals, and biological clocks can all be quietly recruited by something else. And they undercut a comforting assumption most of us walk around with, that an animal's body is always working for the animal. The infected ant makes that final climb on its own 6 legs. The jaws that lock onto the leaf are its own jaws. The force behind that last contraction comes from its own muscle. Almost everything in that final scene belongs to the ant. Everything except the reason it's happening at all, and that reason was written into the genome of a fungus. Exactly where the parasite needs it to, the ant dies. The stalk rises, the spores fall, and somewhere below, the forest just waits for the next worker to walk past. No corpse gets brought back to life here. A living body simply gets redirected towards somebody else's future. And the fungus never needed a shred of imagination to make that nightmare real.